Welcome to Experimental Recording Techniques. We're here at Trax Recording. I'm Noam Wallenberg. Today we are going to try to build the biggest snare drum that we possibly can. And we're going to do that by creating physically the biggest snare drum that we possibly can. So we're going to take a snare drum, we are going to dampen it, and we're going to stick a tom on top of it, and hopefully the thing is going to function like one big snare drum. We're going to mic it all over so that we can access all the different aspects of that instrument, and we're going to try to fit it into a pop track. All right, so here we have our basic setup. We have a 414 underneath the snare. We have a 414 on the top of the snare. The two are at the same angle but opposite so that they're gonna lock into phase. Up top we have a single mono overhead that is a Bill Bradley mic. It's kind of a recreation of a Neumann U47. And on the side here we have an AEA N22, and that's gonna pick up just the whole picture of the entire snare drum, and we're gonna screw it up with a bunch of distortion compression. We also, out in the room, have a pair of AEA 840s. Those are also gonna be smashed up with some compression. So this is the sound of the basic snare drum. We have a big fat snare drum. This is just like essentially a weight that you're putting on the snare drum. It lowers the pitch and it kind of deadens the whole thing. It's similar to the trick where people would flip a drum head upside down and stick it on top of their snare. So with the big fat snare drum, gets a little lower, gets a little splattier. Now we have a Gretsch tom that we're gonna put on top of this. So we're just gonna place it on the snare drum. And here's just the Gretsch tom with the snare. Sounds a little crazy. And on top of that, we're putting a snare weight, right? This is basically just a wallet. You know, it's the same as putting a wallet on your snare that's gonna deaden this tom. So that's the sound that we end up with, right? So each of those elements alone don't sound nearly as big as them put together. Each of these mics are gonna capture a different aspect of it, and then we're gonna put them all together and fit them into the track. We have our drummer, Packy Lundholm. He's smashing on a snare drum indefinitely, so we're gonna see what each of these mics sound like. So we start out with our 414 that's on top. It sounds pretty much like a tom, honestly. The deadening is shortening it, obviously, and we're adding a little bit of high end and a little bit of low end with our Neve preamp EQ, but past that, it's pretty much just a tom sound. On the bottom, we have another 414, and that is gonna sound pretty much like a low-tuned snare. We are gonna flip the phase on the bottom mic. We're not necessarily sure if that's gonna work. You gotta try out both, right? It's not quite as simple as flipping the snare on the top and bottom mics of a regular snare drum because the distance is considerably longer. So because it has to travel that distance, by the time it gets to the bottom of the snare drum, the phase might be over such that flipping it is gonna knock it further out of phase, right? You're not necessarily looking for them to be perfectly time aligned, you're just looking for them to be adding to each other with phase rather than subtracting from each other. So there's the two of them together. Let's look at our side mic. The signal chain on it, we are going through a Chandler LTD1 preamp, and we're adding, it's got an EQ as well, so we're adding a little bit of high end on that. We are then going from there into a second preamp, that's a Telefunken V76, and that is distorting it, right? It's adding a lot of crunch. And then from there, we're going into a Blackface 1176 with all buttons in, right? So obviously we're doing a lot of distortion, a lot of compression. These are the tools that I've chosen to do it with today. I've done it with all types of tools. So you don't, obviously not everyone has all of these, you know, thousands of dollars worth of pre's and compressors at home. I've done this with plugins. I've done it with guitar pedals, you know, using a guitar pedal for the distortion rather than the pre. So you can really do it with anything. It's a really crunchy, ugly sound. We're gonna put it in just a little bit and it's gonna add a little bit of texture to this snare. We have our overhead sound. Kind of capturing the whole thing, right? So it's capturing some of the depth, and if we add the direct mics in without the overhead, we're missing a lot of the natural high end. With the overhead, we get more of the image of what the actual drum is supposed to sound like. Finally, we have our room mics. Now, this is where our size comes from, right? The snare is only so long. All the depth is going to come from these room mics. We are smashing them up with a Chandler TG1. It's a really aggressive compressor. We have it set to limit right now. Equivalent to that would be the TG1234, I believe, made by Waves. There's also a few UAD versions of something like this. Or if you don't have that, just anything that's a really dirty sounding compressor would do a similar thing. We put all these sounds together. We have a really fat snare drum, kind of sounds like a Linn drum, right? And it sounds like that because of the depth, obviously, but also because of how it cuts off really abruptly. It kind of sounds like it's gated. That is partially because of the fact that this tom is going to resonate for a finite amount of time, and as soon as it stops resonating, the snares are going to stop resonating. So when you just hit a snare, that's the only thing that's determining how long the snares are going to resonate for. When you have a tom on top of it, the tom is determining how long the snares are going to resonate for, and they're going to resonate a little longer than normal, and they're going to cut off in an abrupt sounding way. So it doesn't quite sound natural, but sounds reminiscent of like the 80s. On top of this, we're going to add just a little bit of reverb, just to give it a little bit of space in the track, and then we're going to check out how it feels.
Even when the road is dark.